No surprises there, Susan, really. The President of the United States repeatedly talking about how in this Ukraine war, freedom itself is at stake, democracy itself is at stake, and the United States and NATO allies will ensure that Kiev doesn't fall, Ukraine does not fall. A very important speech coming on the eve of the first anniversary of the Ukraine war.
Yes, very important indeed, and with no gaffes. I was thinking last year, if you remember, President Biden, when he gave a speech in Poland, he had this off-the-cuff remark where he ended his speech and said, for God's sake, this man can't stay in power, and he was referring to Putin, and the White House had to backtrack that for weeks. We didn't hear any of that this time during his speech, and we talked about this, Neha, how much he wanted to talk about democracy prevailing over autocracy, and he really pushed through regarding that. And you're absolutely right. The fact that he mentioned the word freedom so many times at the conclusion of his speech really hammered home the message that he wanted to send to the American people, because that's a word that really resonates here at home, that can't be lost in context. But also he again mentioned that there is only going to be some kind of lasting solution and peaceful solution to this conflict if Russia pulls all of its troops out of Ukraine. Well, you know, that's very idealistic at this point in time. And he also, again, mentioned that in the past year, how united NATO forces and the United States included at the helm of it have been, which has been very noteworthy nonetheless. You know, NATO has really ratcheted up its commitment to Ukraine and beyond. But, you know, as we mentioned earlier before his speech, the next year, or moving forward from the first year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, will look very different from the first year. And so we'll have to, you know, anticipate and wait and see, first of all, this anticipated Russia offensive that's expected to come in the spring. And then if China wants to enter the equation more than it has so far, then, you know, how is this going to change NATO policy towards Ukraine, and whether or not Ukraine can really hold up as much as it has, and how much more support, even militarily, is the West and the United States willing to give Ukraine. And I do want to say, you know, the United States has been very careful until now in trying to say that it's not party to this war by not providing certain military equipment to Ukraine. Well, the question now remains, when the President of the United States enters Ukrainian territory, and I don't recall another time when the United States wasn't directly involved in a conflict where the President of the United States lands in a country where there is no U.S. airspace, where, you know, a president's plane can land, where, you know, what kind of message does that send to Vladimir Putin? So, you know, these are the questions that have to be answered, and these are the calculations that Putin will be making moving forward after this speech.
Right. A lot of key takeaways from that crucial address. And yes, you're right in pointing out there, Susan, that this is the first time that the U.S. president has landed in a war zone where his country is not directly involved. Let's now go across to our guest, Colonel David Desroches, joining us. He is a professor at National Defense University. Colonel Roche, thank you so much for waiting patiently as we were live on President Biden's address there. Now, the essence of that important address was this. The president says, 1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kiev. I have just come back from Kiev, and I can report Kiev stands strong, it stands proud, it stands tall, and most importantly, it stands free. Predictably, President Biden has made this all about freedom and democracy, saying freedom is at stake and we will ensure that Kiev does not fall to Moscow. How do you see this address being received in Russia, in Ukraine, and around the world? Because the timing is very significant. The president first visits Kiev and now Poland on the eve of the first anniversary of this war.
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll be favorably received in Russia, and I'm not sure if Russians will actually be able to watch it, given the total state control of the media in Russia. But it draws on a long stream of inspirational statements of determination and commitment to basic American values. If you look at the both the John F. Kennedy Ich bin ein Berliner speech at the Berlin Wall, and then Ronald Reagan's speech 2 decades later, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That's where it's at. So Putin's speech was heavy on policy. It said, we're going to withdraw from the Strategic Nuclear Weapons Treaty. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Biden's treaty was more a statement of ambitions. It said, look, we're going to support these people because this is the right thing. So, it's in that tradition. It's sort of designed to be an inspirational speech. It's designed to signal concentration and assistance with our partners. And at the same time, it's designed to also stand out in contrast to Putin's sort of, direct, these are the specific steps we're going to take.
Right. Of course, Putin has made that very important announcement today. Predictably, he lashed out at NATO in the West, but he has decided to pull out of that important nuclear agreement. What does that mean? We don't know yet, but the NATO chief has said the world is a much more dangerous place. But let me ask you this, Colonel Roche. You said this was designed to be an inspirational speech, but my colleague Susan has been reporting, and many other American guests that we've had on our shows in recent days have pointed out that there seems to be dwindling support in the United States for the country's support to Ukraine. We know President Biden wants to run for the White House again in 2024. How is this likely to play out domestically for President Biden? And also, as Susan very rightly pointed out, how much more support financially and militarily you really think NATO countries are in a position to continue providing to Kiev, given that the war is about to enter year 2?
Yeah, let me start backwards from that list and work my way forwards. So, the military support that the allies can find is a lot less than it was because, quite frankly, at the start of the war, a lot of countries that had former Soviet bloc hardware, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, Czech Republic, they were able to send that to Ukraine at almost no cost to themselves because it was warehoused. Then as the war went on, what we started to see was Western countries providing equipment like 155 millimeter howitzers, HIMARS, and cutting into Western stocks. Well, now a lot of our NATO allies, Germany, France, Britain, are finding that their stocks are dangerously low, and the United States stocks are low of key support supplies as well. So what we're having to do is scour the earth to provide, like Korean rounds for 155 millimeter howitzers. So that is hard. That is a problem that has to be addressed. The United States has stepped up its defense industrial production, and our European allies need to do the same. The next point you raised was fiscal support. That will continue. Money is something that everybody wants, and there's always a use for money, but it's something that the West has, and it's a relative advantage compared with Russia. So I think that will continue. That's much easier to get because there's not much of an opportunity cost for it. The next question you raised was about domestic support in the United States for the Ukraine war. And it is declining from where it was, but it still remains relatively high, and it still remains bipartisan. I think if you disaggregate the question of support, I think that you'll find that there's a couple of questions at play there. The first is President Biden has generally spoken of it as a national event, but some of his party members have tried to say, well, this is something that our party has taken on, and that alienates part of the United States. The second issue is, while we are supporting this war, the costs of supporting it are starting to become apparent. So it is clear that we're dipping into our stockpiles at levels that may be dangerously low. And there's also the issue of the fact that there doesn't seem to be an American strategy to really move forward. The strategy is to give the Ukrainians a bunch of weapons and trust the Ukrainians to use them in the best way. And I think that in the short term, that's the only strategy we could have had. But I think that, Americans don't like to sustain wars. They like to win wars, even though we don't do it as often as we should. And I think that what you'll find is people will start to say, look, we're getting into our war reserves. What is the plan for victory, and start to say, should we be doing something else? Should we perhaps launch attacks on other areas? Should we, facilitate the provision of advanced weaponry to the Ukrainians? Then your first point that you made was about the withdrawal from the nuclear treaty. That does make the world a more dangerous place. But it's important to put this in the context of Putin's overall comparative advantages. The Russian army has been exposed as a much, much worse army than we thought. Russia still remains a premier first-rate nuclear power. And Putin, from the beginning, has reminded the West of Russia's nuclear capability and has at times threatened to escalate and use nuclear weapons. I think he's doing this as a way of deterring the West from providing true advanced weaponry, providing weapons and allowing the Ukrainians to retaliate inside Russia against Russian infrastructure the way Russia has done that. So I hope I got all of those. And I'm sorry for going backwards, but that's how my mind works.
We truly appreciate the comprehensive answer that you have given to that rather complex question. It has many dimensions to it. We appreciate that, Colonel Roche. Please stay on with us. We'll come back to you in just a moment. My colleague Susan Teherani is still with us from New York. I'm also now joined by Anas Malik from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, where President Joe Biden was just yesterday reassuring President Zelensky of America's continued and uninterrupted support to Ukraine for as long as it takes. Anas, an important speech made by President Biden yesterday, an equally important speech made by him today in Warsaw, where he has talked about how freedom and democracy are at stake and the US and NATO will ensure that Ukraine never falls to Russia. How is this speech being received in Kiev?
Well, it's a bit too early to say that how it is being received, but how it will be received, because reactions are yet to come in. President Biden has literally just ended his speech, but the fact that he made quite high references and high notes on the Ukrainian bid, on the fact that how his reassurance or commitment to Ukraine would continue, how thankful he was to Poland to continue assistance with Ukraine, that is something I think that would be largely welcomed by the people of Ukraine by and large over here, and that is something that we would see that that would be that punchline. But one thing I think that probably would has had a miss was when towards the end, when President Biden was making that mention of Ukraine of hosting the NATO allies next year and marking the 75th year. Where it skipped the mention, or it was a deliberate miss, where he could have probably mentioned as a guest invite to President Zelensky. I think that would be seen as a moment of disappointment for Kyiv, but then again, it is too early to judge on that. Kyiv would also be rejoicing for the fact that the President of the United States has reinforced the fact that they will be holding Russia accountable for the crimes against humanity that they have been committing here in Ukraine for the past 1 year. Kyiv would also be rejoicing for the fact that President Biden has made it clear to President Putin that there is no war and the war is to end. There is no war that is being waged from Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian side is defending itself. The moment Russian side stands down is the moment this war will come to an end. So lots of key takeaways or high notes, at least for Kyiv, and Kyiv would want to rejoice on them with this speech, at least. Neha?
Certainly a lot of key takeaways for both Kiev and Moscow, and the president there making it clear that that America will not let Ukraine become a casualty. But we have to remember that it's been almost a year since this war erupted. It has gone on for far too long now. Everybody claims they want peace, but nobody is showing any willingness to return to the negotiating table. Just how much longer will this war go on for is itself a million-dollar question. But on that note, Susan Tehrani, Anas Malik and Colonel Roche, thank you so much for speaking to WION and sharing all those important details with us.